is I want everyone please to close their eyes for just a moment. Don't fall asleep. Close your eyes and picture that it's raining. There's a thunderstorm. It's cold outside. Okay, you got that image? All right, now open your eyes. Okay, that's what it is outside. Don't look that way, okay? All right, well, thanks for having me, and thanks for the introduction. Again, my name is Mike Milligan. I'm with Legato Healthcare Marketing. We are based in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and my colleague that will be presenting later this afternoon is Paige Miller, and she's our digital communication specialist. As Stephanie mentioned, our expertise is in healthcare, in particular in rural healthcare marketing. We're extremely involved. We're a platinum partner with the National Rural Health Association. We dive very deeply into that industry. First of all, excellent program this morning. Great stuff, great topics from everyone. I think what our role today is to complement, frankly, many of the things that you've learned, and it really helps to kind of hear that. We kind of feed into that a little bit. Maybe there's some areas that we might emphasize differently, or not differently, but a little bit more, what have you. So again, great topics, and we want this to be, as informal as possible. So certainly we'll have questions as we go, questions at the end. But if you have questions as we go along, just feel free to to speak up and ask the question. So a little bit of a tack that I'm going to take today is certainly supporting everything that we've talked about. With my background, even before the agency, I've been involved, I guess you could say I've been in your shoes in many ways before. I've previous positions in healthcare. I was VP of Public Relations for Aurora Healthcare in Wisconsin, Vice President of Marketing for Prevea Health, a multi-specialty clinic in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So that kind of a background in working for other health systems kind of gives me a perspective as well. So I kind of have that agency and that corporate side. And so what I'm going to talk about today a little bit is, as we look at the topic of what we have today, which is on techniques or in rural healthcare marketing, kind of an overarching theme that I'm going to have today a little bit is that, yes, there are specific techniques, yes, that we can and should continue to use, but it's also about making sure that as professionals, as individuals, as rural healthcare marketers, as healthcare marketers, that we are doing everything possible to elevate our role in our organizations and to be very proactive. And in some ways, trying to really continue to help people understand that role that we play, that it's not only tactical, but it's a strategic role that we carry in our organization. So a lot of the things I'll be talking about will be emphasizing that. And when Paige speaks later, she's going to, again, kind of get into a little bit deeper into some than I will, into some of the digital areas. I'm going to cover that kind of just broadly, and she'll complement what Randy and Fred shared today. Okay, so the first thing, in fact, I think we used some of the same sources of information. A lot of our information is from the Pew Research Center, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. Yeah, exactly. But one of the areas here, kind of a little devastating, I guess, in a way, humbling. 80% of CEOs don't trust marketers. Okay. Now, this is in a broader term. This is not necessarily healthcare marketing, but probably holds true, right? Okay. And why don't they trust us? And the answer generally is because they think we lose sight of our purpose, okay? And again, that's going to be sort of the theme today a little bit is, okay, so what is that purpose, and building that consensus a little bit. So why are we here? Great lunch, great soup, great cookies. We didn't have to have cookies, great chips. But I mean, why are we here in general as health? What is our role in our organizations, okay? So feel free to anybody, just in general, what would you say, anybody who wants to kind of just chime in? What's our function? What's our purpose? Why are we in our organizations? Awareness, okay. What else? Drive consumers to our services. Build business, right? Okay. Certainly, that isn't all of it, though, because we know, it depends on who you might have as a leader in your organization. He or she may be very volume driven, which is great, but we also know that we have responsibilities as marketers as well in terms of building goodwill, community engagement, all those types of things as well. But ultimately, and we've heard a lot about measurement, and we're going to talk more about it today, that is the reality, right, of how are we going to demonstrate the results in our organization. So that's generally what our leaders are looking for. So part of that is thinking like a CEO, okay? That's a compliment. It's funny, Paige has kind of picked on me sometimes because I'm a creative type in many ways, but yet I'm also own my own small business, so I kind of have both sides of that brain a little bit, and sometimes they conflict with one another, I realize. But what I'm trying to say here is that as we're engaging with our leaders in our organization is to be thinking like those CEOs in terms of what are their expectations, what do they need from you, and in some ways, again, really elevating that role in your organization. So as an example, again, thinking analytically, okay? So getting to the point, being summary-oriented, certainly in many ways being, using language regarding profitability and patient volumes. And I'll show you in just a moment, but it's kind of sometimes thinking outside of what leaders might think that our role is as marketers. Sometimes they might think, well, they're the advertising people, okay? But as we know, we're so much more, right? We are, first of all, we're marketers. Yes, we build volume, but we're also communicators. Communicators in many ways, many issues that come up, whether or not they're issues with the business community or internal communications or all of those sort of things. So, but my point in all of this in terms of kind of the overarching theme about how do we continue to be successful is that we have to make sure that we are building a culture in our organizations where we are elevating our role and we are demonstrating that credibility. And by doing so, just like anything in personal life or in business, as we continue to do that, as we build that sort of credibility, then people listen to us more, right? If we act in a certain way, we behave in a certain way, we think in a certain way in terms of what our leaders are looking for. Okay, so part of that means, and these are just some things that, I'm sure many of you do these already, so like a lot of conferences, hopefully, we affirm some things that maybe you pick up some tidbits, some things that sort of, oh yeah, I need to be thinking more like that. So I don't mean to be preaching to you. I'm sure you know a lot of these things, but I think in many ways they're helpful reminders. And frankly, they're things that I have learned throughout my career, not always the easy way, learned through my mistakes and everything as well. So, but first of all, reading, studying, and understanding strategic plans and financials. So it's like anything we want to be proactive. We want to, even if we're in a position where maybe we're not, maybe we are, maybe you are at a sweet seat or leadership table, but maybe you're not. But really being proactive and saying, I'd like to take a look at the strategic plan. I'd like to see what kind of business plan we have. I'd like to make sure that I have access to market data. How can I get access to market data? How can I be proactive and go in front of CEOs or other people and say, these are the types of things that I think that we should be doing, and not necessarily waiting, to be told what needs to be done, okay? And so part of that obviously is understanding your marketing plan, developing a plan that's in line with those goals. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in just a second. But again, in understanding, kind of being in that psyche of understanding and addressing major concerns of your administration, of your C-suite. Certainly, as we know, there are certain things that are obviously around volume and image and all those things that we know, but sometimes there are even things that, again, maybe administration doesn't typically think of when it comes to marketing, how they could help with that. And I'll give you an example in just a second, but again, in terms of that, knowing how to talk to your CEO, so no marketing jargon as much as possible. One of the things I've learned is even though I really do think that marketing in many ways is an investment, especially when you're speaking with a CFO, don't use that word. You kind of lose credibility. You certainly talk about ways in terms of how we expect to see a return on the expense that we have. Just being kind of honest with them that, but we're doing this for a reason. But sometimes we use words like investment, we kind of, in my experience, have lost credibility in that way. But then, and this is kind of the crux of the whole matter, is building consensus on what we're going to do. And we're going to talk more about results here in just a moment. But building consensus on the objectives, the strategy, the timing, the results, and the measurement. So, I mean, if you think about how many times in your career you've maybe thought you're going in the right direction, and then you get kind of halfway through it, and someone kind of throws a red flag up and says, why are we doing this? Or that's not what we're looking for, and all of that. And I know it sounds very basic, but it's just a good reminder that there are ways that we need to try to involve ourselves in these kinds of conversations up front and really clarifying what is it that we're trying to achieve, how are we going to achieve it, what's our strategy, all those sort of things. And again, I'm going to go through that in a planning process here in just a moment. Okay, so as an example, one of our clients is Holy Family Memorial. They're a medium-sized hospital in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And kind of what I was describing before, their particular situation that we were addressing, and it's very detailed, so I'll just kind of give you the paraphrase of it, is that they were having some issues regarding perception of their quality scores. And I say perception of their quality scores because there were some mixed reviews. There was one particular organization that was rating them that maybe had some biases toward their competitor, kind of a long political story. But then there were some other quality scores that were more favorable. But the fact of the matter is that the competitor was using some data that was a little bit slanted in terms of building a poor reputation within the employer community and then ultimately the consumer community. So a couple things. When you have a situation that's a public relations situation, of course, it's a matter of, yes, you have to fix the problem and then you have to fix the message, right? And fixing the message doesn't always mean fixing the problem. So they were, kind of working on both simultaneously. So in terms of that working simultaneously, and we at Legato certainly assisted them with this, but this is, I think strong marketing is a good combination between strong operational improvements and marketing that supports that. And the two together is the best combination. But in general, what this whole thing was about was a message around utilization, okay? And really the message about, from a business perspective, of that we're promoting the right care, the right settings, and the right outcomes. So in other words, we have a message that we're using healthcare properly. And without getting into all the detail, that message kind of related to the cost message, and we kind of explained how those, and the perception messages, and we kind of explained how all of that came together. The point behind that is that, again, this is where you might think generally, where does marketing come into play on that, right? I mean, maybe people who don't always know what we know about our profession might think, okay, well, what's marketing going to do? They're going to do an ad campaign or what have you. But as we know, marketing is so much more than that. It's about the messages that we develop, the relationships, the referrals, all of those sort of things. So fortunately, there was a strong marketing leader within this organization. They brought us in to help them with that strategy. But again, it's a very proactive way of developing that relationship with their C-suite. So part of this whole message was, from a consumer perspective, is developing something that's called a Life Empowered campaign. And in essence, what this did is it sort of brought a face to this general term we talk about in healthcare, which is quality. Okay, it's how do we help people really understand what quality is? And so when we were looking at this message, we had a message to employers that, again, was probably more financial, more numbers, things like that. But when it comes to consumers, that's a different animal, right? I mean, we know in healthcare that, generally speaking, healthcare is very emotional. It's an emotional message, so we have to look at ways to help people relate to that. So this Life Empowered campaign that I'm mentioning, what this was generally about was to say to people that we're going to help you as an organization live a healthier lifestyle and give you the tools to do that, but you also have to do it yourself. And we're going to provide you all the education, all the things to do, but together it's a partnership, okay? And that was all, in terms of our messaging, was really tied into then, they had a number of excellent quality scores in a number of different areas. So as I'm about to show you, some of the communication that we did, and one of the communications was a landing page that had all of the quality data on it that was all obviously very positive and supportive for them. But as we drove people to that landing page to these communications is then when they saw the numbers, the positive numbers that reinforced that message. But on the other hand, if we would have had just, for instance, an ad campaign that was talking about quality numbers, we would have lost them. Okay? So as an example, this was, and there were all kinds of components to this, but this particular one was more of the ad campaign, again, putting the face to quality. So these particular people were people that overcame, particularly difficult situations, and they're attesting to the quality of care and the outcomes that they received through their care. And then, as I mentioned, as they went to this landing page, consumers were given considerably more information about, about the results. And I'll show you here too. I might have to click it from here, I think. It doesn't seem to be going, but that's okay. So what this was it's a television spot that was supportive of the ad campaign you saw there as well. But then we repurposed that ad campaign to a number of different videos as well that we pushed out through social media and all the different channels that we've talked about this morning. So again, the whole point behind this is that it's looking at something that we traditionally look at as, okay, what does marketing do? But if we're proactive in our thinking, and we know as marketing leaders that our organization is facing maybe some kind of a perception issue, how can we be proactive to say, you know what, we have some recommendations. Here's an approach that we should take, those types of things. Okay, and some very positive results in terms of online impressions. This did include TV as well, a number of video hits and all of those types of things. So very good impressions. Outcomes in particular, the bottom one here is one of a perception outcome, which ultimately was what we were trying to reach. So our quantitative research, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the importance of that in a minute, but within a 12-month period of time, the quality and perception scores of the organization overall increased by 30%, which is unbelievably significant. I mean, that is not anything that you can, to move that sort of a percentage in 5 years would be remarkable. So we'd like to think that the marketing had some things to do with that, as well as the operational changes that the organization was making. It certainly resulted in new business as well, in particular in their cath lab and some other specialty areas. So the point behind this, again, is what I've mentioned. It's all about planning, right? It's all about making sure that we know where we're trying to go, what our roadmap is. And we know in the healthcare industry in particular, we face this sort of, in the rural healthcare industry, we face sort of this dilemma of, we really are in this predicament where we have to do all of the things in many ways that the larger healthcare organizations do, but we have to do it with fewer resources, okay? We don't have the luxury of, so we have to be smarter sometimes, we have to out-creative them, we have to outthink them in many ways. But it also means that maybe we don't try to do everything as well. We pick a finite amount of things and we do them very well. So in this regard, it's being the top dog, even if you can't be the big dog. So just as an overview a little bit here, so what I want to kind of encourage and instill with you a little bit, and this is a planning process that we go through with many of our clients, but I think you can take many of these principles and just make sure that you don't necessarily need an agency to do many of these things. You can do them yourselves, with the right support and the support of leadership and those types of things. So, a couple takeaways before I kind of go into each of these is if we look under stage 4, and this is again our planning process. If you look under stage 4, that's the creative work. That's okay, all the fun stuff that we do, right? Sometimes we'll have a prospective client or a new client will come to us and say, we have this issue, and can you fix it with an ad campaign? Okay, how many times have you guys heard that? Put an ad out there, fix it, right? So, I'd like to think we were that good. I think we do nice advertising, but as we know in healthcare, there's so many other things that affect volumes, right? Referral relationships, whatever they might be. So the point is this, is that there's a lot of things that we have to do more up front. And so I'm going to go through and highlight some of those areas for you. Okay, so the first step in this planning process is what we call a chart review. Okay? And a couple takeaways on this is that, so what I'm trying to do is kind of apply what we do to what you can do on your own as well in takeaways. But remember how I was sort of mentioning, to kind of be proactive, get that strategic plan, those types of things. But also, if you're not already privy to it, make sure that you're seeing, again, patient satisfaction data, physician satisfaction data. Do you have access to referral patterns? All kinds of data that are probably there that if you're being proactive enough and looking at that you can kind of identify the opportunities yourself and then bring those forward in your organization. Certainly understanding where your competitors are from a marketing perspective, what their messages are there different things, are there weaknesses that we can capitalize on? Again, just really being proactive about thinking about those types of things. Okay, so then, after doing that information, gathering that information, then like from our perspective, we use our insight from working in the industry and kind of put that together and kind of make some hypotheses and things like that and run that past you. And you would certainly do that as well. Oftentimes, that might require, depending on the situation, of looking at some primary research. And again, we understand that there's a cost associated with that, but from our perspective, it's critical. Doesn't mean you have to do research every year or whatever. There's different aspects of research, but generally speaking, I'm a big believer, for instance, in doing some kind of a quantitative study where we're measuring perceptions of different service lines of the organization. Because again, as we talk about, we have this sort of struggle of how are we going to demonstrate the return on our investment. We have to have some very tangible types of goals. One of the ways that we can have those tangible goals is through research. We can look and say, for instance, we have a awareness of orthopedics among an age group of 45 to 55 who have private insurance of this percent in our secondary service area. I mean, we can get that detailed. And then we can look and we can say, we can base our goals on that and say, okay, now realistically, what are we trying to achieve within a certain period of time? And so then by doing that, it really helps to focus our marketing efforts. Sometimes I'm also a believer in qualitative research, in particular focus groups. I think sometimes just helping us sort of to dive into a particular situation where we believe we want to go a certain direction, although we know that focus groups aren't necessarily scientific per se. They do give us a lot of direction or maybe affirm some sort of a hypothesis that we have or nullify a hypothesis that we have in some way. So it just helps us to gauge things a little bit. Certainly in the area of brand development, as I could give a whole session just on brand development, but in general what we're talking about here is more in many ways brand identity than brand development, but a brand, as I'm sure you're aware, is kind of broader than what your logo is and those types of things, but it's who you are as an organization, what your key messages are, what do people think and believe when they experience your organization. But the last point here I want to spend a little bit more time on is service line prioritization. And this is an area that I guess from my experience of even before Legato and certainly at Legato seems to really resonate the most with our clients. And what I'm getting to is, I guess I can remember I mentioned at one point I worked for Prevea Health, which was a multi-specialty clinic, and I think at the time they had 52 specialties. Okay? And I came into the position and I was trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to focus on? And the direction that was given to me was take the budget, divide it by 52. Okay. Obviously that wouldn't work. Okay, it wouldn't work from a number of perspectives. It wouldn't work for one thing, just think about from a media exposure perspective, right? How could you actually do that? From a resource perspective, you're just pulled way too thin. So that is kind of an outlier in a way, but to illustrate a point that really that Our philosophy, my philosophy, is that we do a finite amount of things and we do them very well. We don't try to be everything to everyone. And I think in particular when it comes to rural healthcare as well, that there's kind of two sides of it. Sometimes I feel like there are rural healthcare organizations that maybe undervalue what they do. They think, oh, well, we're a rural healthcare organization. We can't do all the things that they do. And the fact is that there are many things that you can do with a little bit of resourcefulness and that type of thing. But also, the point I'm making is that also to not try to be someone who you're not as well. Okay, if there's a certain service line that's really being fully developed in a larger metro area, we kind of have to weigh a number of options to see whether or not that works for us. But I just want to kind of just have a little bit of a discussion about, so this service line prioritization, it's kind of like, okay, how do we decide what we're going to invest our money in, what we're going to spend our money in, okay? So when you look at a finite amount in your budget, how do you know as an organization, what kind of criteria do you think you have to look at to say, I wonder if that makes sense for us as an organization to invest in? What are some of the things that might come to mind for you? In terms of, you look at a service line and say, I think it's worth marketing that because of this. What would this be? Outreach, and what was the other one? How many people does it affect? Absolutely. What's the target? What's the potential volume that we can increase? That kind of thing. Okay. Other things. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So revenue, in some ways, I'd say maybe not even revenue, but profitability. But revenue and certainly absolutely capacity. Right? How many times have you been asked as a marketer to kind of turn that spigot on and off? Okay, we're ready to market. Okay, we're not ready to market. And also maybe sometimes being asked to market something that isn't market ready. It kind of fits into the capacity part of it too, but sometimes there are areas where maybe something isn't market ready because we have a customer service issue, or maybe we have an insurance issue, or we have a capacity issue. What else? What else when we look? Go ahead. The need. Okay, the community need, for instance. Okay, great, excellent, absolutely. Other things. We kind of mentioned profitability. Obviously, that's a big one. How many of you are asked to market to sponsor the Christmas parade and okay, I got it. And and of course all the high school teams and all those sort of things. And I'm not trying to say that those aren't important, because I understand that they are, but it's like a lot of things. We have to make strategic decisions about what we're going to do and what we're not going to do. So, without getting too analytical for you, and by the way, if you're interested in just email me some point. We have some tools that you could use just to that list these criteria, things like that you could use to work within your organization. But the general idea behind this is that, and every organization is different, okay? But you establish what those criteria are in your organization, okay? And many of them are going to be the same. They're going to say yes. But then the key is, how do you rank them, okay? As an example, I've had organizations where they will say, community goodwill is the top thing, because maybe they had some kind of a reputation problem that they needed to overcome or something like that, and that's the priority. Okay, so they're going to do all the Christmas parades, or they have a huge competitor that's maybe coming close to them, and they want to make sure that they sponsor this run before the others does, or whatever it is. Okay, so in that regard, when we look at our priorities, that might weigh a little more heavily, okay? On the other hand, and it's pretty common that profitability is usually number one, okay? But even with that, sometimes it takes us to kind of go back and to challenge. If we go through this exercise, it helps us to challenge others in our organization to say, these were the criteria, these were the priorities. So in other words, when you establish your marketing objectives based on these criteria, someone stops by your office and says, did you know it's National Laboratory Workers Week, okay? And you say, great, congratulations. I'm proud of you that we recognize you as an organization.
And we'll put it on Facebook.
Exactly. Exactly. And maybe that's a little bit to the extreme, but there might be other service lines. Like, for instance, oftentimes it really contributes to our organization, but maybe you have a hospice program or home health or something like that where the people are really wanting promotion and things like that. But you look at those criteria and you say, not really a moneymaker, okay? So, and I could go into a lot more detail, but in general what we do when we list those criteria is then we put them into tiers, okay? And the idea is that kind of 3 tiers, and if something is in tier 1, that generally means that we're going to probably put about 70% of all of our resources into those service lines, okay? Those service lines may be 3 service lines out of 20, okay? And then we'll have a tier 2 that's about 20% and a tier 3 that's about 10%. And there might be 50 things, I'm exaggerating, there might be 20 things under tier 3 that have to represent that last 10%, if you follow my logic. So again, it's kind of getting back to that doing a finite amount of things and doing them very well. And if you're building that consensus in your organization, then when you have these marketing objectives and these challenges and people come back to you, if you have involved your leadership team from the beginning, they should also be your support when a very difficult doctor comes through and says, where's my ad, or what have you. I mean, I'm a realist. I've been there as well. I know sometimes you just have to do it. But what we have to get to is a point where we kind of have that backup and that support to be able to kind of go back and to show people, okay, this is what we decided on. These were the criteria. These were the marketing objectives. Now, I could do these things, but at what cost? Do you not want me to do these things? Kind of trying to get into that mentality in your organization. Okay, so we get to that point. Then, I've mentioned a lot about objectives and such, okay? So we all know we develop various stages of marketing plans. The one thing I would just say is that kind of getting back again into that measurement part of things, that a marketing plan certainly is a lot more than a list of tactics, right? It doesn't have to be a big book that we dust off and no one reads either, okay? It has to be kind of back to that original point in terms of being succinct with our audiences and such, and kind of getting to the point. As far as objectives go, so we always hear, show me, how do you know if that billboard was effective, right? I don't know how many times I've heard that. And certainly, from what Fred and Randy shared this morning, what Paige is going to show this morning, one of the advantages among many of the digital aspect of our world is that it's one of the areas that actually is quite a bit more analytical. So thank goodness. But we also can analyze a lot of things in our marketing world outside of digital. My whole point behind this is that when people ask me, was that billboard effective, I'll say, what was your goal? And it's not necessarily what was the goal of the billboard or the outdoor. It was what was the goal of the service line initiative? What was the goal of, were we trying to raise awareness to a certain level within a certain period of time? Were we trying to drive volume? What were we trying to do in particular? And also, as we all know, an outdoor board, as an example, is a complement to hopefully a much larger type of initiative, right? It supports what you're doing. Generally speaking, in that context, you're not using an outdoor board to drive a message. You're doing it to reinforce something that you've already driven through a number of different other vehicles. So my point behind this is that I know it's oversimplifying, but if you know what your goals are, then you can, whether or not you have a positive ROI of whether or not you achieve them. So, speaking of objectives, so maybe just if a couple of people could throw out in the room here a little bit. What's an objective to you? Okay, what does that mean when we look at marketing? Can someone maybe just give me, and put you on the spot, but kind of an example of what an objective might be in a marketing world? You kind of mentioned some things before about profitability, for instance. Increase market share, absolutely, okay? Increase volume, those types of things, okay? When we look at marketing objectives, we kind of look at them, and I encourage you to do the same thing, is to look at from a couple different perspectives. What you've described, we kind of label more as pure marketing goals, okay? They might be things like increase market share from X to Y by a certain, obviously they have a time period, they're tangible, right? By a certain period of time, we can get real specific. We should in terms of maybe measuring some specifics about the demographics, maybe the payer mix, whatever we can do, and certainly geography. As much as we can define that as much as possible, then when we come back and we look at what we're actually going to do, everything that we do, we should look against those goals and say, okay, is it going to help us? Is it going to help us move the needle or not? The other thing that I would say, though, is that we also have a lot of goals that maybe we can't, that I call more communication goals. Okay, so they're still very important, but ultimately maybe they lead to the marketing goals. So those things could be anything from, all the analytics that we're talking about in terms of digital marketing, to website hits, maybe how many people attended a community education program, all those kinds of things that it's important to kind of develop those metrics. Now, you can do this in different ways. But generally speaking, what we're doing with some of our clients, some of it they do on their own, some of it we do jointly, is it doesn't have to be anything really complex at all, but it could be something like you have a shared document on a Google Drive, okay? And you have all of these different goals that are listed. Some of them are the business-related goals, some of them are the communication goals, and you're developing this tool together, and you're analyzing it together, and you're looking at how you're doing, and then you're sharing that with your leadership, even when the results aren't good, okay? Here's what we learned from it. We tried this campaign, it didn't quite work. Here are some of the takeaways that we had from it. Here's what we're going to do next. I'm just saying from experience that just goes so far in terms of when you're developing that reputation, that credibility within your organization, that you're really going to be perceived, because you are, of being a strategic leader. Okay, so from there again comes the fun part of doing all the, if we're doing advertising, that kind of thing, of doing all the different materials, the digital or whatever it might be. And I kind of mentioned a little bit about ROI and measurement. So as a quick example, kind of in terms of results, this is another client of ours. This is Black River Memorial Hospital in Black River Falls, Wisconsin. And these are some of the results in terms of, and I just kind of pulled out right now orthopedic surgery. Increase in usage of outpatient procedures. This is actually in a 16-month period of time. These are the real broad strokes, but the goals that they have on their marketing plan are kind of what I described before. They're very specific by market, by geographies, but some great results. One of the things that that was really very helpful in terms of our research is that when we looked at, I guess it's probably not that abnormal, but it was just a good affirmation. As we looked at our research from a primary and a secondary market, for the most part, we had a fair market share in the primary market, but our secondary market had gone down a little bit. And so from a marketing perspective, not that we ignored the primary market, but for a good year and a half or so, we put all of our emphasis on, not all of it, but a lot of the emphasis just on the secondary market. And you can kind of think about how that might come into play in anything that we're doing. All the things that we're talking about now with digital marketing, for instance, and how we can really do a lot of targeting and geo-targeting and all those types of things, the email campaigns that Randy mentioned. Of course, a lot of the traditional campaigns as well, all of those sort of things of how we can really focus on that. And fortunately, we really turned those numbers around. And so now as we kind of go, to subsequent years, we have kind of balanced out our marketing a little bit, but in terms of those markets. And so as we look at that data, the perception study that we've done and everything else, we use that to form specific goals for each of these areas. So for instance, urology, women's health, sleep disorders, all those areas, and we develop specific measurable goals in different, the PSA and the secondary service area. I'm not sure if our video is working, so I'm going to kind of skip through this, but what this is, if you happen to at some point want to, or I can send you a copy of this presentation as well. I don't know if are we posting these at all anywhere for people to pick up the presentations too if they want? Yeah, okay. And the video, that's right. So if you go onto here as well, the Black River's website has, the whole idea behind this is that it's kind of like that Holy Family Memorial scenario that I described before, but it's a complete library of different patient testimonials, but they're supporting many of these service lines as well. And so the whole idea is that we're using those videos to, again, develop kind of an emotional connection to drive volumes in those particular service lines. So I also just wanted to focus again, kind of in that context of where I was mentioning that sometimes when we look at marketing and people might have a certain perception of what it does or what it doesn't. For this particular client, we help them with, I'm sure you're familiar with the kind of the concept of the voice of the customer, kind of fits into how what we're doing to engage with our community, what we're doing to listen to them and change accordingly. So we're doing this with a number of clients, but in this particular one, we kind of set up the whole program where we recruited various people from the community that would be part of this advisory board, and where we kind of gather insights and where they engage with the community. We kind of test out different things, from anything from what's your experience in our lobby, to what kind of experiences do you have with our clinics, to what's the food like, to ideas that you have. And as you can imagine, it's just an excellent way to really just engage with them and to really demonstrate, in particular in a rural area where everybody really talks to each other quite a bit, is to really build that engagement. And so we kind of set up that program from there. I facilitated the first couple of those forums, and then from there we transitioned that to our client to be able to take from there. We mentioned a lot about email and direct mail and all of this, and I think there's a time and a place for everything. We have found, even though there is more and more of a push toward digital, which we certainly support, that particularly in rural communities, that direct mail and publications are still very effective. In fact, when we looked at Black River's research in particular, when we asked, for instance, about their preferred way of receiving information, despite all the different advertising they do and the digital and everything that they do, their magazine came up as the number one source that people preferred in terms of receiving their information. So many of you probably do your own publications, that type of thing. The general idea behind this is that we were talking about the 80-20 rule before when it comes to social media. Maybe quite not that distribution, but the idea is that we're providing valuable information here. We're positioning their organization as a resource in their community. Certainly we're working in areas of service lines that we're marketing, but it serves as a very valuable tool to build those kinds of relationships. And in particular, I was mentioning too about the primary and secondary service area. So in this particular market, we looked at our distribution, and we really kind of hit that secondary service area a little bit stronger with this publication. So, and I kind of mentioned the results on the orthopedics, so just to kind of give you, this was some of the creative, but the reason I'm showing this is to just point out as well that one of the takeaways that I'd like to share when we look at service line marketing is we're looking at identifying a problem and a solution is what we should really be thinking about. Certainly we always have situations where, yes, we have a new surgeon coming in, we have a new physician coming in, we want to promote him or her. But again, what we were kind of talking about before, what Lisa was talking about this morning when she referenced how to pitch a story and those types of things, is thinking about the patient and what they're experiencing. As we know, a person isn't saying, gosh, I was really looking for a new urologist to come into town, thank goodness. But maybe they were looking at it and saying, gosh, I didn't know that I really had to deal with this problem of incontinence or whatever, that it really is normal and there really is a solution for it and this person can help me. So the marketing that we should be doing is around that problem solution type of thing. So I'm going to wrap this up in about 5 minutes or so. And the other area that I just wanted to cover, because I think oftentimes it's overlooked, is internal communication. And I get a drink of water here. Again, in that context of maybe not always, people always realizing what we do as marketers. I put this up because actually just recently we had a couple clients that a marketing director would call. One particularly I'm thinking of that called me and was a little frustrated at her CEO because, and I'm sure you've uncovered similar things like this, but where we're going, in 2 hours we're going to lay off, these 3 key people, or we've come to, we've come at an impasse with this surgeon, or something else sensitive that we need to communicate. And the marketing director asked me, what can I do about that? And how can I, because the administration is going to send out a memo, and they already showed me the memo, or he called it a memo, it was email, called it a memo, and it was just written very inappropriately. It was going to alienate people, what have you. And it was a very difficult question to answer, and we worked through it, and I ended up speaking with the CEO as well. But the issue is a larger one in that we were already at that situation where maybe the C-suite wasn't quite valuing the role that marketing has in terms of internal communication. So kind of like what we were talking about with marketing, it takes a while to kind of get to that point where what we want is that our C-suite or whatever is getting to a point where, oh, this sensitive information is going to be coming up. Let's get us involved more up front, okay? So let's, prepare the documents ahead of time, those types of things. So again, as we look at everything that we've talked about today, all these things kind of relate to one another because these are all, as we're continue to be proactive leaders in our organization, we'll have that credibility and people will, to know to come to us for those things. So just a couple fundamentals, and I know that many of you have been involved in internal communications throughout your entire careers, but just a couple just quick reminders of things that, if anything, they're things that we might remind our leaders in our organizations as well. Internal before external, okay? And what I find sometimes is that we, not necessarily us, but maybe others in our organization, don't fully realize or comprehend the comprehensiveness of defining something as particularly sensitive in an organization. There's a sequence to it, as we know. There's politics, there's a sequence, right? Sometimes I've been involved in organizations where, there's been a hospital I worked with in North Carolina where there was kind of a major layoff, and we had to go from, okay, we're going to announce to the employees this, to the CEO walks in through this other room and talks to the press. And then there was a whole sequence of things in terms of when board members were notified, the business community, all of to really orchestrate that whole type of thing, and it's just so critical. And so that's where as leaders we just want to make sure that we are being proactive, and frankly, if we need to be a little pesky, a little assertive to help people understand that, that's fine. So again, in being proactive versus reactive in terms of having people come to you, but more of having you come to them, provided again that they're actually letting you know what to expect, right? What are the things that you are going to be responsible for communicating? So again, a couple other quick takeaways here. Again, in terms of internal communication, being strategic. Oftentimes in our communication, even when it's sensitive, sometimes our leaders might want us, to, I want to say lie, but not tell the whole truth. And and there is a little bit to that. Of course, in public relations, it's a matter of we don't have to say everything, but it's also important to be honest, okay? And so that's our challenge, too, is to make sure that we're being honest. One of the takeaways that I don't have on here that I've really learned, if there's one thing to take away from on the internal communications, is that if you're developing plans, before a crisis might happen, before a smoldering crisis might happen, and you think that there has to be some kind of a legal approval of something, do that way ahead of time. Anticipate various things that might happen. That same hospital in North Carolina, unfortunately, we had a nurse who stole some medications, and it ended up, I won't get into the details, but it created a kind of a barnstorm. And in that particular situation, we hadn't kind of predicted a situation like that. And so at the time that we were trying to get the communication out, the attorneys were really holding up the communication. It was really creating a public relations problem for us. And sometimes it's a lot easier to kind of have those conversations way up front before, to kind of anticipate these various scenarios, because emotions aren't high and people are a little bit more practical in thinking about those types of things. So, and then the other point here in terms of integral to every communications plan. So we mentioned, that marketing plan. You saw the tactical grid, for instance, that Randy and Fred put up. All of those sort of things. Always just second, sometimes we overlook it, but really thinking about that internal communications. And as we know, that our employees are really the ambassadors of our message, right? We have to make sure that they're on board first. They understand what's happening. Many times they're a very integral part of our community. So, and this is just to make the point that, we all learn in different ways. So the different tools that we've talked about, sometimes video work, sometimes, visual, different ways that we communicate, and just to kind of keep that in mind. And then in terms of other forms of communication, again, there's lots of tools that we're aware of. Many of those that we've talked about here today. The one that I would, out of this list, that I would just sort of pull out and emphasize a little bit is the employee ambassador program and the leadership forums. If you're the leadership forums in particular, if you're not as an organization, really conducting kind of regular sort of in-person meetings with your employees, again, that is an excellent way to kind of build rapport with your CEO to help him or her understand the importance of that. The idea behind that is you're presenting to employees and updating them on things. It's that whole transparency thing that I talked about before. So it's not a matter of just going up and saying all the polished positive things, but it's being real and saying these are the types of things that are working. These are the things that are not working. This is where we need to improve. By you as a communicator helping your CEO develop that sort of rapport and trust with your employees overall, again, helps your presence in the organization. So with that, I would just leave you with a couple questions, rhetorical questions, and I'm happy to take your questions. The questions would be, are you a leader, or what do you need to change in order to do that, to be a stronger leader? How can you increase your value? And hopefully some of the things that we've talked about this afternoon would help you in doing that. How can you help marketing perceived as strategic versus tactical? So thank you. Happy to take any questions.
This is a
Yeah.
question that's isn't it like a standardized or something in general that you can help us get through, like for an effective marketing plan? And sometimes the CEO says, okay, you need to lay out the whole year in advance. Please give me the strategic marketing plan. I'll give you 2 weeks to do it. Is there a guideline?
Sure. I mean, we've all probably have different formats. It depends on what they're, we could email you a template if someone's interested, but just like a kind of a big Gantt chart, where you list, all the things you're doing, what the timing in, who's responsible, put the measurement in there, those types of things.
What are the priorities?
Right. Ultimately what we're looking for is, before we get to that tactical chart, that we're having those conversations that we had before in terms of really nailing down, not that we're as leaders kind of going back and working with our administration as well and saying these are the areas that we believe that we should market, not necessarily just waiting for them to tell us what areas we need to market. Other questions? Staying awake? That was a lot of stuff.
So, I know not all of the marketing professionals are involved in like the executive.
Right.
So, any suggestions I know that I'm involved, which is great because then I do know the strategic plan and we can talk about things.
Sure.
But I know there's a lot of people that aren't. And they
Absolutely.
ask how I got involved in
Right.
before I got it.
Yeah, and you could probably answer the question as others could answer the question as well. I guess a couple things that I would say, and again, I know that there's different politics and organizations, so you want to make sure you're not going over someone or what have you. But it's, it could be something as simple, frankly, is inviting your CEO for lunch. I mean, and having a conversation with him or her and saying, a lot of times people want to mentor other people as well. So, I mean, if you sat down with a CEO and said, I'm looking to I want to continue to develop my expertise in terms of leadership and strategy and those types of things. How can you help me do that? What kind of pointers can you give me? Could I get involved in more ways? But the other thing that I would mention is kind of what I've covered here a little bit, which is if you gather all of that information or get access to that type of information that we're talking about, is being proactive to say, I was looking at the data and I was wondering why we're not doing this. And again, depending if you're a marketing director or if you're below a marketing director in your organization, you kind of need to follow the proper channels of command, if you will. But either way of, really just, thinking for yourself, being proactive and saying, this is what I recommend, or this is something, or even this is something that I'm thinking about. It looks like it's a good opportunity. Could we talk about it? I think, people really appreciate that. That is something that I think when I look at my career and how I kind of advance through the corporate world, a lot of times when I would get into a new position, it's one that I would actually create, just sort of by doing, and all of a sudden I was kind of in that position because I was, a little bit more assertive and kind of just made it happen before it was given to me. So, any other questions? Great, thank you very much. Let's take a quick break, and then Paige will share some information on digital marketing. So, thank you.